Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Street Talk. Thank you all so much for attending. My name is Steve Starsevich. I'm a volunteer with the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition and a leader of its Transportation Action Team. Street Talk is an annual event, this year co-sponsored by the City of Corvallis Active Transportation Group and the Sustainability Coalition's Transportation Action Team. The goal of this event, as the Street Talk webpage states, is to, quote, bring together a vibrant presentation with an engaging discussion on how the Corvallis community walks, rides, rolls, and interacts with our streets. Before I introduce the program, I'd like to share a couple of Zoom tips. First, please locate the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom window during the question and answer session immediately following the presentation. As a question occurs to you, please enter it in the Q&A window and don't forget to press enter. The second Zoom tip is that we suggest you watch the presentation in side-by-side mode so you can see the speaker and the presentation at the same time. To change the view mode, locate the view icon in the upper right-hand corner of the Zoom window. All right, let's get started here. So I'd like to tell you about how street intersection design became our subject for tonight. Last spring, the Sustainability Coalition co-sponsored a Safer Streets lecture called Rethinking Streets, presented by Dr. Mark Schlossberg, who is professor of city planning at the University of Oregon. He leads a study abroad course to Denmark and the Netherlands, two countries that have revolutionized city street design and have shifted from cars dominating cities to cities where most people bike or walk. His Rethinking Streets books highlight case studies of American streets redesigned to include active transportation and the success they've had at increasing walking and biking. Mark was blunt in his talk. If a city is serious about cutting its carbon pollution and reliance on fossil fuels, if it's serious about truly safe routes to school for children, if the city really wants to promote active transportation and make walking, biking, and rolling safe, comfortable, and convenient, then it has to do these three things. Install separated bikeways or protected bike lanes on every busy street. Number two, provide a connected network of neighborhood greenways designed to limit vehicle speeds. And number three, build protected intersections at the junction of busy streets. Mark focused on number one and number two. As for three, he said that needs a whole other talk. Protected intersections received a lot of interest from the people who attended Mark's talk, and here we are. I think most of us understand at some level the safety challenges of intersections. But this report by Corvallis Right of Way really helps put Corvallis intersections in perspective. Crow analyzed 4 years of Corvallis police reports from 2011 to 2015 involving motor vehicles colliding with someone walking or bicycling. They tallied up 189 reported collisions. That's over 47 per year, almost once a week. And of course, this does not include unreported collisions or frightening close calls. In their collision reports, the police recorded the human behavior that led to the collision. 2/3 of them were caused by a motor vehicle driver making a mistake at an intersection and striking a person walking or biking. We could focus on that human error, the mistakes the driver, the cyclist, or the pedestrian makes. In fact, that's what a lot of traffic engineers do after a crash or a collision. But instead, I'd like to refocus our attention on a fundamental safety principle of the Dutch Institute for Road Safety Research. Humans make errors and willingly or unwillingly break rules. This is a given that cannot be changed. So roads and streets should be designed in such a way that this natural human behavior does not lead to crashes or injuries. So how can this safety principle be applied to the design of intersections? How does a city even begin to implement intersections that are safer for everyone and encourage biking and walking? Well, these are perfect questions for our street talk speaker. His talk is entitled Intersections for People, Design, Implementation, and Community Benefits. When I asked local experts who I should try to get to give a talk about intersections, they all said, get Nick. Nick Falbo is a senior transportation planner at the Portland Bureau of Transportation. He specializes in the design of urban transportation networks, spaces for people, and multimodal complete streets. Nick contributed to and illustrated the NACDO Urban Bikeway Design Guide, which is the standard for integrating bikeways into the fabric of American cities. He has popularized the design concept of protected intersections for bicyclists and serves as guest lecturer at the Institute of Bicycle and Pedestrian Innovation at Portland State University. I'm very pleased to welcome Nick Falbo.
Thank you, Steve. Hi, everybody. I really appreciate your time today. As Steve said, my name is Nick Falbo. I grew up in Eugene, Oregon. I went to the U of O and I moved up to the big city after college. And so now here I am, a senior transportation planner at the Portland Bureau of Transportation. Before joining the city, I worked at a national firm planning streets and networks for cities all across the country and contributed to some of those early design guidelines that really focused on bringing protected bike lanes into the US. And my 2014 video called Protected Intersections for Bicyclists became a little bit of a mini viral hit that articulated Dutch intersection design practices in an American context. And by simply giving it a name and giving people the terminology to talk about the design, it really helped open doors for American traffic designers and engineers to embrace these features. Now, it's important for me to say tonight that my presentation tonight is not on behalf of my employer, and it reflects my opinions only. I may even say some things tonight that are really pushing boundaries even in the Portland context. And while I'll also be talking about engineering related things, I am not an engineer. I have a design background and I do a lot of work in the realm of physical street design, but I mostly use this knowledge to try to help build consensus around a different way of thinking about our streets. And in the end, creating new streets is a collaborative and bureaucratic practice. It involves engineers, it involves urban foresters, land use planners, and most importantly, the community itself. And it takes a lot to do this work, especially if you're trying to do things differently than ever before. So with that introduction, I have a lot to share with you tonight. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. So today's presentation is focused mostly on intersections, but I am going to just warn you, I'm going to meander a little bit. I'm going to try to orient us to kind of where we came from, to help inform where we're going to be going in the future when it comes to transportation design. As a little bit of a tease for what we'll be talking about today, I want to take you to Fremont, California. This is a city with large auto-oriented arterial streets that have been designed to put cars first. You can see here wide travel lanes, this free flow slip lane turning right at the intersection. They do have a little pedestrian island here, but it's a little bit scary in its size. And there's some painted bike lanes, and but you know, they're buffered, but I still wouldn't want to bike through this if I didn't have to. But now this is what that intersection looks like. Today it has more space for people and it's a more safer, more comfortable place. The engineers on this project had to make big trade-offs to make this happen. They removed that slip lane to make this possible. I'm sure that was helping to keep traffic flowing at this intersection, but it's important for us to remember at what cost. The project team had to prioritize space for people and safety for people over moving cars as quickly as possible. And doing this kind of work does require new priorities for your city and their staff as they're exploring projects in your city. And I think it's hard to maybe realize this sometimes, but I found transportation as a field to be a highly innovative field. It feels like things are always staying the same and nothing's changing. But I don't think that's quite true. And I think we can just look at the last 50 years and see how Oregon has been a leader in transportation innovation. You know, in the 1970s, they led the way with their bicycle bill, which is considered one of the first complete streets policies in the country. And it's probably the reason that Corvallis has many of the bike lanes on its arterial streets that it has today. In the 90s, cities like Eugene were experimenting with bike boxes as a traffic safety feature to improve bicycle transportation. Also at kind of the turn of the 90s and the 2000s, Portland was leading the way with experiments in colored bicycle lanes. For those of you who are around, we had blue bike lanes back then, following the Danish model. And the evidence built by this work supported what is now kind of the color of green for green bike lanes that we're seeing in cities all across the country. And now we're trying to just follow in those footsteps in bringing more innovation into our cities. Since being pitched in 2014, this design has really taken off with official endorsement by FHWA and a little bit of an arms race among cities to incorporate this protected intersection design into their projects. But in our quest to kind of design for the future, I find it really helpful to center ourselves in the past, to kind of understand where we came from and how we got to where we are today, and what does that mean about where we can go in the future. To illustrate some of this, I've got this chart that was dug up from a report in 1970 or 1972. This is a chart that shows the relative usage of transportation modes in Portland for 150 years, since the beginning of the city in 1840. It was developed as part of a freeway environmental impact statement. Each line, I know it's not super easy to see, but each line represents a different mode of transportation as it goes from the beginning of sort of Portland to what was the present in 1970, looks like 74. And you can see the beginning of Portland, it's all pedestrians, horses, and boats. And these modes shifted and grew as the city expanded. But then technology changes introduced other modes of transportation. Around 1870, 1880 was the rise of railroads that helped you connect cities, and the streetcar that helped you expand cities. That had a rise until around 1920, peaking out as the heyday of the streetcar era. Dropping back down and then being replaced, in this case, by automobiles. This was developed as a part of the plan for a freeway. It had a goal, which was to convince you that the domination of the automobile was undeniable and inevitable. And this empty space here leading to 1990 really begs you to fill it with more cars and less of everything else. But I take away a little bit of a different story from this chart. You know, I see a story of change. I see that cities are changing all of the time, and we get so lost in what feels like that status quo that we forget that stability is the exception. I also notice how fast things can change. Within a lifetime, whole ways of traveling basically vanished and whole new ways of living emerged. So I asked, well, what comes next? I really love this chart, and I wanted to see what happened since 1970. So I dug up some census data to try to figure that out. And while the original chart wasn't necessarily a scientific chart, it actually seemed to track pretty well to what I was seeing in census numbers. So I filled it out, added kind of the gaps where I could, and then I extended it even into the future. So this is really pulling out lines that I've then projected to the city of Portland's mode share targets for the year 2035. And what this tells me is that there is hope. You know, history tells us that things can change quickly, and some of our mode share targets for the city of Portland that maybe seem a little bit crazy, when put into the perspective of the last 150 years, look a little bit more realistic. But I think it is worth noting that in many ways, we've been here before with our aspirations for a better future. The 1970s had a bike boom, and there was an increased consciousness about the environment, not that unlike what we have today. The same types of ideas that we're talking about right here, right now, were talked about in the 70s. This is a photo from 1967 of a protected bike lane in Davis, California. These were the types of ideas and infrastructure that we started to experiment with in the 70s. And we've been talking about it for 50 years. These experiments were kind of quickly abandoned and then largely forgotten. Not only that, we started to document these ideas also in a way that has largely been forgotten. This is a couple screenshots from a design manual from 1972, and it's got some pretty incredible stuff in it. As someone who's been part of the growth over the last 10 years of protected bike lanes, it's shocking to see this little diagram in the lower left that shows a parking protected bike lane. Here's your bike lane, here's your parking, here's your travel lanes. This is a chart in the upper left that shows what is the right facility type for bicycling based on how busy your street is. If you've got high speeds and high volumes, yeah, you need protected bike lanes. They knew this in 1972. And what we're talking about tonight, the protected intersection, here's a drawing of it in this guide. This was something that people had been thinking about, and it hadn't quite landed. I would like to think that we're now in a position to move forward with these ideas, but it's just very humbling to kind of see where these came from and to know that we're building kind of on the back of a long history. So our objective right now, really in transportation planning and design, is often geared at trying to reduce the impacts of driving or to reduce driving itself. Whether your cause is traffic safety, pollution, urban noise, or global climate change, dependency on driving is the problem. And designing streets and intersections where transportation outside of a car is safe, available, and attractive is the solution. To do this, we need to start approaching things differently when we're doing transportation design. We need to switch from a passive approach to street design to a proactive approach to street design. The NACTO Urban Street Design Guide describes how these approaches are different. Passive design is built on our understanding of the present and our patterns from the past. It uses past traffic counts, present traffic counts, projects out to the future. We design for the worst case scenario in terms of traffic or user behavior. We do design based off of standards rather than context that we're in. And the traditional rules are full of self-fulfilling prophecies, having to do with clear zones that try to make us safer, but just make us go faster, or 85% speed rules that let us increase the speed limit because people want to drive faster, and creating a never-ending feedback loop. A proactive design is much more intentional, and it starts to turn these on their head. I think the most important element to start shifting towards is to design toward the future conditions that you want. And we need to be saying that we want more people walking and design a street that would encourage more people to walk. We need to be saying that we want more people biking and design a street that encourages more people to bike. In practice, you end up with two very different results. These passive designs shown on the left allow drivers to travel unpredictably at high speeds. This whole idea of providing wide open roadways as a matter of safety, this might make sense in some traditional engineering fields like stormwater engineering, where you need a big pipe to move the extreme amount of water for a one big day event, or architecture where you're designing for potential earthquakes. But it's disastrous when you apply these ideas to normal city streets. Over-designed buffers, clear zones, and setbacks, not only they're designed to account for crashes, but they end up encouraging unsafe speeds and create more dangerous crashes than ever before. But proactive design recognizes that human behavior is what governs traffic engineering, and that it is fundamentally adaptable and not fixed. People adapt to their conditions. Changing streets changes behavior. And designing for the fastest is creating more fast drivers. So in this case, we need to start designing for that future we want. A passive approach builds a wide open road and assumes that everyone has equal access to it. Do you want to ride a bike here on the left? Go ahead. Do you want to cross the street? Go for it if you dare. But a proactive approach says that, yes, we want people to ride here, so we will provide bike lanes. And yes, we want people to cross here, so we'll provide a safety island to cross at. And this is the type of intentionality that we need to be bringing to our work. Feeding the cycle of passive design is a phenomenon called induced demand. This is the real self-fulfilling prophecy of that traffic volumes will always increase, and we must always build more to meet that demand. But what actually happens is that capacity expansion of our congested roadways generates the new traffic that the traffic model itself predicts. These projects offer an illusion of relief at first, but are quickly filled up with new people and new trips. This shows a kind of motor vehicle capacity at a one-lane street, but with projected traffic growth, more than this street can handle. And had we just left it alone, that traffic growth would never have shown up. But by building for this future, we get this future. This has been studied so much that it's called the fundamental law of road congestion. Travel increases proportionately to roadway lane miles for highways and slightly less rapidly for other types of roads. When you expand roads, you get more traffic. And now we're just as congested as before, with even more motor vehicles on the road and everywhere else in your city. Maybe the poster child for this is the Katy Freeway in Houston, Texas. This is incredible. They widened it from 8 lanes to 23 lanes for a cost of almost $3 billion. The goal was congestion relief, but it didn't work. After construction, travel time along the corridor increased by more than 18 minutes. This is a 33% increase over pre-widening travel times. And now they have more people stuck in more traffic. And while this is a big project and we can understand how big projects can influence people's behavior in a big way, this same general philosophy applies to our local streets as well. So when we've got an arterial street and a big intersection, the more we're facilitating auto movement, that contributes to the very same dynamic as this freeway widening, where we're easing the mode of driving and simultaneously making everything else that much worse. So the real question is, can this work in reverse? Can we go from induced traffic to reduced traffic? This is sometimes called traffic suppression or traffic evaporation or disappearing traffic, but it's the intentional reduction of lane capacity on congested streets as a way to limit and reduce traffic in our cities, and most importantly, to free up space for multimodal mobility. And this isn't just talking about a normal road diet. Road diets are great and we need to be doing them, but they're generally only recommended in areas where traffic volumes aren't too high and these impacts are small. And I guess I'm here to say that you can do it even if the impacts are large, and we may need to. This is going to be how we're going to dig ourselves out of our auto-dependent present. This has been studied quite a bit, mostly in the UK. And one study in particular, led by Sally Cairns in the early 2000s, looked at over 60 examples of motor vehicle capacity reductions in congested corridors. She looked at projects that were construction projects, long-term projects that reduced capacity of major roadways to see what would happen. She looked at disaster projects, like maybe you've heard in San Francisco, a whole freeway was collapsed during the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. And it was replaced with a street that carried far less traffic. And she also looked at intentional policy choices. We've got a great example of this in Portland, where we removed Harbor Drive Freeway along our western waterfront. In 1968, the road carried 25,000 vehicles per day. It was expected to increase to 90,000 by 1990, but they removed it in 1974, and in its place built a wonderfully loved park. And rather than see more traffic onto adjacent streets, the removal saw 9.6 fewer motor vehicle trips across downtown bridges. Her study identified the following conclusions. When road space for cars is reallocated, traffic problems are usually far less serious than predicted. Overall traffic levels can reduce by significant amounts. She notes anywhere between 25 or 50% of the diverted traffic appears to simply vanish from the network. And that really, people react to change to road conditions in a much more complex way than has traditionally been assumed by traffic models. We need to treat people as the more flexible people that we are, and we make rational choices in the face of rational changes. And I'm sharing this with you because we really need to find ways to wrestle our cities back from cars. We're gonna have to make hard decisions and kind of move into a new way of thinking about what kinds of change is possible. So getting back to bicycling and intersection design, guiding our work in Portland is the belief that bicycling should not require bravery. This is coined by Portland's bicycle coordinator, Roger Geller, in his paper, The 4 Types of Cyclists, published in 2009. In this paper, he sets the foundation for understanding not just what we're designing, protected bike lanes or neighborhood greenway streets, but more importantly, who we're designing for. Today, his framework is fully endorsed by the FHWA and verified nationally by researchers at PSU. It breaks users into different types of bicycle riders. There's the interested but concerned, the somewhat confident, and the highly confident. These groups have varying degrees of stress tolerance, and you can really see their makeup on our city streets today. Most cities are really only operating in this highly confident territory because they don't have a built-out network that is lower stress. A lot of bike-friendly cities have embraced the somewhat confident riders, Portland included, which is a growing share of the population, but really we're not quite getting there yet. The key to a transformative future is in attracting the interested but concerned to our streets, and they require low stress facilities. The interested but concerned includes everyday people doing everyday things, or running errands or going shopping. You've got kids traveling independently. And this is where we're going to be meeting the needs of the majority of people in our cities. To reach this crowd, it really leaves us with kind of two options. We've got neighborhood bikeways, and Steve kind of pointed to some of these. We've got neighborhood bikeways for our residential streets, our neighborhood streets, and we've protected bikeways for our busy streets. Protected bike lanes are located next to the road and physically separated, providing people with the confidence to bike to work, school, markets, parks, and restaurants, or just explore on the weekends. This passage comes from People for Bikes and their Activating Support for Bike Infrastructure resource page. It's got great messaging that you might want to think about adopting as you're talking with the community about why these types of facilities and intersections are needed. But we know we can't just build one or two great protected bike lanes. We need to create a network that connects people from where they are to where they want to go. To illustrate this effect, I'm going to point to Portland. In 1990, our bike network was minimal, and so was our bike ridership levels. The network, which you can see in these black lines across the city, it really didn't connect very well, and you couldn't get to everywhere you needed to go. The densest part of our network development was in Southeast Portland, which is also where bike commute activity ended up being the highest. After 20 years of intentional development of new neighborhood greenways, new bike lanes, everything changed. By 2012, we'd done a dramatic expansion of our bikeway network in these inner neighborhoods, and came along with it a dramatic increase in bicycling within this area. It's pretty incredible. Some of these neighborhoods clock over 25% bike commute mode share. This is an incredible statistic, and it sort of is on par with some European cities. And you can see that where we're building the network is where we're seeing the riding. I think our next frontier is East Portland. We've been spending a lot of time in Portland, like trying to build out in the more suburban development portion of our city. These black lines, a lot of these are skinny painted bike lanes on arterial streets, on 5-lane streets, and they are not doing the job. That's pretty clear just from a map like this. And so we're doing a lot to try to upgrade these facilities to bring low stress bicycling into the area. And this is really the challenge for Corvallis. With luck, we'll start to see these types of networks of connected, protected bike lanes and neighborhood greenways built here. The blue lines are all kind of local streets that could be calmed to become neighborhood bikeways. And these red lines are your busy streets, your high stress streets. These are the streets that we're going to need to work to get separated bike lanes to create a street that feels safe for everyone. And as you start to build out this network, you're going to run into questions about what do you do about the intersections. This is where we get into intersections today. So even the best road diet or bike lane can really lose their benefits when you get to an intersection. Intersections at their worst, they really ruin the facilities that they're on, and they're not great places. Intersections can be confusing, often with a lack of clarity about how you get to where you're going. This is especially true for people walking and biking. If you're on a big, busy street, how do I turn left? How do I make this connection? How do I get to this path across the street? They can be stressful with activity coming at you from all sides. You can feel exposed with long crossing distances to cross these wide multi-lane arterial streets. And they can also be dangerous places. In Portland, 71% of all pedestrian crashes occur at intersections, and 44% of all pedestrian crashes occur at signalized intersections. We often think of signals as maybe the answer to a lot of our safety problems, but signalization alone is not necessarily going to fix the problem. This reality really drives Portland's Vision Zero initiative, which has identified our most dangerous intersections for prioritization of safety fixes. Intersections can also be places where people are breaking rules. Steve mentioned a little bit of this, that Dutch principle that people will make mistakes. Maybe it's intentionally, maybe it's not. How many of you have tried to cross the street and had no one driving yield to you so that you could safely cross? A study out of PSU found that poor yielding rates are common. Drivers don't yield to pedestrians in general, and they are even less likely to stop for and are more likely to crowd Black pedestrians. This starts to become a real issue of equity in engineering. We can design a crossing to create more yielding and result in more equitable outcomes, and we should. And as it turns out, drivers often aren't even looking for us. A recent research study out of the University of Toronto revealed that more than half of drivers don't look for cyclists and pedestrians when turning right. This is a photo from the study. This is this cool little video head glasses that the driver's wearing. And they were just looking at who was scanning where when they were turning. And no one does. So what do we do with that? How do we design an intersection that is still safe, even if drivers aren't even looking where they're going? Well, we know that intersections don't have to be so scary. Intersections can be great places. Intersections can be centers of social life. I've heard that you have some of these intersection paintings in Corvallis. This is really a great symbol of kind of where community can come together. Now, this is a quieter neighborhood street, but the principles still apply in larger intersections. Intersections can also be places of connection. This is where modes intersect. This is where people get off the bus and become a pedestrian, or where they park their bike and go hop on the bus. This is where the sort of multimodal interactions happen. And we want to make sure that things are safe and intuitive if we're trying to support a non-auto dependent future. Intersections become places to wait and to gather. Often when you're walking around, this is the place where strangers and people you don't know are standing in close proximity. It might be a little bit weird here in 2020 and 2021 to think about that, but maybe it's even extra important in an area of isolation, where we can give more people more connection with one another. And they can become places for commerce. Portland's known for having really small blocks, about 200 feet by 200 feet. And the story I've always heard as to why that's the case is because the real estate agents wanted to have more corners. They wanted to sell higher rents to the corners because that's where everyone wanted to be. You wanted your restaurant on the corner. You wanted your retail shop on the corner. It's premium real estate. And so they can be these great places for rich street activity and street life. So today we're here to talk about not giving up at the intersection. Good bike infrastructure doesn't leave bike riders, motorists, or pedestrians to navigate incomplete connections that force everyone into unsafe and confusing situations. Too often that's exactly what we do. And it really doesn't matter if you've got a great protected bike lane or buffered bike lane, if the protection and the markings all go away at intersections and you're left to fend for yourself. So there's 5 core intersection design principles that you should keep in mind when you're developing or reviewing or commenting on intersection designs. And we often don't get these things right. It's not always easy, but I think this is maybe something you can use as you're evaluating the work being done in your city. The first is to provide adequate sight distance. You want to give people walking and biking and driving a chance to see each other. But when your vision is blocked by parking or you don't have the space, you don't really have a chance to do the right thing, to stop fast enough, or to even realize that you should be looking and seeing and stopping. You want to minimize exposure to conflicts. We do this often by narrowing the roadway or narrowing the crossing, by simplifying the crossing to just minimize any mixing and sharing on our busy streets. You want to reduce speeds at conflict points. Some busy streets have high speed limits. That may be okay for uninterrupted stretches, but it's not okay in areas where people are mixing or sharing with people biking. It's not okay where drivers are turning across pedestrian crosswalks at high speeds. Slower is safer, and by slowing the speeds down, you can give everyone the chance to react. You want to communicate the right-of-way priority. Sometimes it's not obvious who needs to yield to who. I mean, I think the law is pretty clear. People turning on streets need to yield to people walking and biking. That's what the law says. But we should be designing a street so that this is an obvious and natural behavior. And I don't think we often do. And then finally, we want to maximize comfort. I think if we could do the top 4 things, we'd be creating much more comfortable places. But there's even more that we can do, including a wider separation from traffic where possible. We can include green planted buffers and street trees in our designs. We could provide public benches for sitting, bus shelters for waiting, and other people-oriented design features as a part of our streetscape projects. I'd say illustrating the issues of conflict and design philosophies, you can see this diagram where on the left, it is the traditional design of conventional bike lanes and shared lanes. If you're a bicyclist and you're trying to navigate an intersection, the area of exposure is the whole intersection. Drivers who are turning right might have to cross your bike lane, leaving you exposed. If you want to make a left turn, and this is how they are accommodating you, you've got to make it over to the left turn lane. And throughout the whole time, you're at risk of potential conflict with turning vehicles. There are some designs to try to minimize that. Mixing zones, very popular treatment for protected bike lanes. They might work pretty well in slow speed urban conditions, but as you can see, you still have a pretty exposed zone where you're mixing with moving traffic. And which is why we're now pushing to try to get to even lower stress and lower exposure. And that brings you to things like roundabouts, which are getting more popular, and protected intersections, which maintain the separation as long as possible and really focus all conflict points down to its bare minimum. We're gonna kind of use this little virtual intersection here as a diagram as we walk through the features of a protected intersection. This really is our kind of worst case scenario: big, busy streets, a little bit chaotic feeling. How do we make this better? Well, the first thing you really should do, if you can, is put this road on a road diet. We're not going to be able to create the world we need if we're constantly widening roads or we're leaving ourselves just the crumbs to design with. I think you'll find that most of our streets have enough space. We're just using it in the wrong way. So let's take this street here and put it on a road diet down to a 3-lane cross section. That's given us a new bike facility, protected bike lanes on both sides of the street. This 3-lane street is a safer street, a calmer street, and an intentionally slower street. But it's still not great. This is a dramatic improvement over what was there before, but the intersection was largely untouched. It doesn't really look or feel any clearer to me about who has priority or how to navigate and make connections between these new bike lanes. So let's do a quick analysis. What's wrong with this and what do we do about it? This intersection, as it's kind of designed here, has issues around visibility. You can see this driver, they're blocked by this parked car. Parking protected bike lanes are good. They can be a really great way of creating a safe feeling bike lane, but they can potentially create visibility problems at intersections and driveways. There's issues around exposures on all legs of this intersection. Even though only part of the road is kind of the travel area, pedestrians will still feel kind of threatened at every point of this crosswalk. You don't feel safe anywhere on this road when you're crossing. It has issues around turning speed. This road diet may even be providing a wider turning path than before. This results in fast speeds at conflict points. Kind of the wider you can turn, the faster you can turn. And in general, it has kind of a lack of clarity about priority. We've got a nice marked crosswalk here, basic crosswalk markings, but I don't know if that fully clarifies who is supposed to yield to who for most drivers on the street. And then overall, it's just a relatively uncomfortable place to be outside of a car. And I'm sure you can think of dozens of intersections or Corvallis that look just like this or feel something just like this. So how do we build in these design principles to reduce risk and bring benefits for everyone? The good news is that we can solve all of these problems, and we can use the space from the road diet to install protected intersection safety features. So let's bring those principles in and see what we can do to make this a better street. The first thing we want to do is kind of pull back the parked cars on this protected bike lane to make visibility. And if we can, we want to pull forward the people waiting at the intersection so that we can increase visibility even further. we want to find a way to physically narrow the crossing to minimize exposure when crossing the street. Just down to the bare minimum, what is the actual zone of the street that has the threat of motor vehicles? Now, let's minimize it to that small, and that should be our crossing distance. We need to better define this corner, especially now that we have all of this extra space. This will help us manage speeds. A wide open corner lets you turn at high speeds, but a tight corner does not. And we need to mark this to be a little bit more clear for the walkway and the bikeway to indicate kind of who has priority. And when you pull all of these features together, you start to create a protected intersection design. This looks like a pretty dramatic facelift, but we haven't necessarily changed that much of the function of the street. And we've really just hardened that edge between motor vehicle traffic and everybody else. And let's zoom in and kind of take a look at what's happening here. First, by limiting parking and adjusting where people biking and walking cross, we've opened up sight lines. So here's that same car that now has a clear view of everything that's happening at the intersection. And here are people walking and biking who are already kind of so far ahead in the intersection that they can be clearly seen. You do this by limiting parking before intersections, anywhere from 20 to 60 feet, generally depending on the speed of the road. The faster the drivers, the longer you need to be prohibiting parking and maintaining that clear space. The next step is to reduce exposure. We do this by establishing these pedestrian safety islands between the bike lane and the roadway. This gives pedestrians a place to wait or a stop point, and at the very least defines that edge of where is it relatively safe and where is it relatively dangerous, and minimizes that crossing distance to just a bare minimum. So instead of crossing 50 feet or 60 feet, you're only crossing 30 feet or 20 feet, depending on the design. This also reduces exposures for people bicycling. So you can get that same shortened crossing distance, and it also provides those same types of waiting areas, a safe waiting area for you while you're crossing the street, or in this case, making a left turn. Making a left turn with a protected intersection is the easiest, most comfortable thing you can do, no matter how big the street is that you're trying to cross. It's a two-stage turn. You do have to go across the street, stop and wait, and then wait for another green light, but it's definitely worth the trade-off in terms of comfort and safety and legibility. We also need to deal with turning speed. The corner safety island right here is what provides protection for people waiting at the corner, but it also slows down turning cars by defining that turning radius. We recommend about 15 to 20 foot radius, which is perfect for passenger cars. It's great for a standard person in their sedan in an urban condition, but it's not that good for large trucks. This tends to be one of the points that we really run into a lot in urban areas, is how do we design for a passenger car, which we need to have a tight corner to have slow turns, but also how do we accommodate large trucks that we rely on for deliveries and large vehicle access? Well, the trick there is to use a truck apron. So you get a smaller island defined for that truck. So a passenger car would go around this kind of pink area, and a large truck, if needed, can mount on this part of the island to let them make that turn. And it's this type of smart design that lets us meet both of these maybe competing objectives. The corner island also helps with yielding by creating a wide separation distance between the travel lane and the crossing for people walking and biking. The sweet spot here is around 16 feet of depth. That's actually enough room for a whole car to kind of turn and stop and wait and not feel a lot of pressure behind them. But studies have shown that there's the safety benefit to this design in as little as 6.5 feet, which means that this design can fit on a lot of your bike lane streets today. And by forcing the car to turn before the crossing, it really changes how users interact with one another. And it gives people walking and biking more physical priority at this intersection. And it gives drivers the chance to see and to stop. Even those drivers who weren't looking before the turn, they'll see you when you put them in a design like this. This extra space can also be used to maximize comfort for people in general. As an added benefit, we can enhance transit on a corridor like this. You can build floating transit islands to create a better stop experience. There's more room for shelters, for benches, for landscaping. Other features such as bike parking can be added here to create a type of mobility hub for people connecting to transit. And the extra room on the street could also be used for things like trees or other landscaping to bring more beauty and nature into our streets and into this space. So while this maybe looks a little bit like an alien intersection design at first glance, it's becoming more and more familiar all across the country. We have a couple of these in Portland, and I'm going to try to kind of give you lay out some rules as to when you should be considering a protected intersection design, where it fits well, so you can know where to use them as you're evaluating potential places in Corvallis to bring these treatments. The application for protected intersections, generally it is a tool for busy streets. You want to put this on arterial streets or collector streets. It's not the type of design that you'll bring to your local neighborhood bikeway. The streets themselves generally need bikeways. It's really the protected intersection works best with the extra space provided by bike lanes, protected bike lanes or buffered bike lanes. But in some cases, you can do it with conventional bike lanes as well, depending on how much space you have. Often if you've got a bike lane with a parking lane, you can kind of combine that space together and get the room you need to squeeze in a protected intersection. For context, you generally want to use these wherever you're trying to emphasize circulation between bikeways, which probably wherever bikeways intersect, but it's particularly useful for complex transitions. If you've got a trail on one corner connecting to bike lanes on the other side of the street, this type of design can simplify circulation in a very intuitive way that helps you make those connections at complex transitions. And I didn't talk a lot about signalization, but you're at a traffic signal in a lot of these cases, and you can use that to improve safety for people biking. Where you've got really high volumes of turns, left turns or right turns, you tend to need to provide a dedicated turn lane. And when you start to getting into that territory of needing turn lanes, you may also be in the territory of wanting to consider a protected bike signal phase, where you can separate out the turning cars from the through traveling bicyclists to really minimize that conflict. So as one case study, one example in Portland, there's a location in Northwest Portland, an intersection of 20th and Thurmond, kind of a new developing area that was sort of formal industrial land becoming more residential. And this street had a few complex connections. Unfortunately, it's sort of hidden by the freeway here, but there is a two-way protected bike lane coming in on the north side of the street on the east side, as well as under the freeway here on the north, another two-way bike lane. But it connected to a street with protected bike lanes to the south and another street to the left. And to the west, how do you make these intersect and circulate? And so this was using a protected intersection designed to help make that circulation simplified. If we zoom in, you can see that to the west, there's actually no bike facility receiving these bike lanes. Maybe someday we'll get bike lanes added to this street, but for today, it kind of just dumps you into the road and has you kind of fend for yourself. But this is the kind of design you might use on a neighborhood bikeway. So if you did want to connect where a neighborhood bikeway intersected with a protected bike lane, this type of design could potentially be used here. Here's what it looks like on the ground. You'll notice it's a stop sign intersection. This is a little bit unconventional. There's not a lot of these stop sign protected intersections, but they work. They work and they help you make that connection. So you can see there's that two-way connection under the freeway that lets you circulate between the multitude of different bikeways that connect on this intersection. But where they really shine is on large streets, is on big streets. This is a large arterial street in East Portland, 148th and Division. And as a part of a transit project, we were also upgrading the intersection. And we kind of said, hey, if there's any place to try a protected intersection, this is it. We've got the space in the width here. And we've got the room in particular where we had these kind of extra added turn lanes and slip lanes. And so we just kind of claimed this outer portion of the roadway for ours and turned it into a protected intersection space. Here's a photo of it from a rainy day just a couple of weeks ago. We've only recently kind of turned it on. It's very, very new, and we're learning a lot already to inform future installations of arterial protected intersections. And both of these projects were reconstructions of streets, pretty highly expensive capital projects. But it doesn't have to be expensive. Other cities are experimenting a lot with quick build design. So we can see examples here, San Francisco using paint and post and speed bumps to create that same protected intersection design, including even the kind of truck apron area, so that they can get these on the ground and get their safety benefits faster. Quick build design is a little bit tricky. It maybe is tough to maintain in the long run, but if you're trying to get those safety benefits sooner rather than later, this is a good way to do it. Here's another example of a quick build protected intersection, paint and posts. It's a little bit, always shocked by all these traffic markings sometimes. Other cities are experimenting with using solid color to create a more clearly understandable, maybe less traffic oriented looking design for protected intersections. Here's one in Oakland, California. And here's New Jersey with their protected intersection done with paint and posts. So these don't have to be expensive. They can definitely be done as a retrofit and done on the cheap. There's a lot of guidance out these days. The last few years have really been a huge boom in terms of high quality guidance for building low stress intersections and low stress facilities. I really like the FHWA Achieving Multimodal Networks guide. It's a really good resource for, in general, improving walking and biking conditions. And NACTO has published Don't Give Up at the Intersection, a guide to designing protected intersections and other key features. So as you move forward in Corvallis, trying to build a better bikeway network, build safer intersections, I wanted to give you some recommendations from up in Portland, kind of what has been helping us as we move forward as a community to advocate for these things. First is make friends, build a broad constituency with Safe Routes to School, with AARP, with other walk and bike advocates. I just heard someone say the other night, build relationships, even if you're not yet building infrastructure, because those relationships are what's going to help you get to where you need to be. You want to be able to articulate the problem, really focus on shared concerns and messaging. Traffic safety affects us all, and solutions can support safety and mobility for all. And the more we can have a broad tent in terms of a shared vision for the future, the farther we can take things. It helps to identify top priorities when you're organizing around improvements. When everything's a priority, nothing becomes a priority. It's really going to be it's really a long game when it comes to like advocating for change. And so knowing where you want to focus your energy really helps. Data-driven identification of high crash intersections, like what Steve shared earlier, can really help focus energy on those shared concerns and pick, which of those intersections are the worst, and let's make sure that those get fixed next. And then I think it can help to build political support. The world of planning and design and engineering and funding often is a political arena. And the more you can create a vision and a platform and a list of priorities and get candidates to sign on, the more you're able to kind of keep their feet to the fire when they're elected and keep things changing. With that, thank you so much. This concludes the presentation. I look forward to the discussion with all of you today, and I'll be providing this presentation and a list of all of the references that I mentioned in this presentation, so you can dig into this some more over the coming days and weeks. I'll stop sharing and we can talk.
Thank you, Nick. For those of you who arrived late to the talk, Nick will be answering your questions. I'd like to direct your attention to the Q&A symbol at the bottom of the Zoom window. You can click on that and enter your questions. While you are typing your questions for Nick into the Q&A window, I'd like to introduce our moderator. Born and raised in Corvallis, Sarah is the Sustainable Transportation Manager with Oregon State University and co-author of OSU's 2030 Sustainable Transportation Strategy. Please welcome Sarah Bronstein.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Nick. That was a fabulous talk, and I enjoyed your meanderings and many of the technical details. It's nice to be able to geek out on transportation with someone, and I can see from the questions that we've received so far that we've got a few fellow transportation geeks in the audience. But I'm also going to start off by just asking you some really super basic questions just to get things started. I want to start with the premise that Mark Schlossberg posed, which is that if we are serious about reducing our VMT, reducing our vehicle miles traveled, and reducing our greenhouse gases, we need to install separated bikeways or protected bike lanes on every busy street. What do you think about that? Is that possible? Is that advisable?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, when you look at cities all around the country, they all have their bike plan. I imagine Corvallis has a bike plan, city bike plan. And I haven't looked at it, but my guess is it does not recommend putting bike lanes on every busy street, right? Like it probably has a subset of a bike network. And even in Portland, like our bike plan doesn't necessarily say put bike lanes on every street. And we definitely accept trade-offs. And I guess I would say that that's really a strategy to try to get there. You know, that bike plan is the bike plan for the next 15, 20 years. And then you do the other bike plan, and then you're going to build on that. You're going to do more. And so the kind of inevitable end game is exactly that, is yes, we want protected bike lanes on every street. I would say, however, there is some philosophy out there that maybe you don't necessarily need bike lanes on every single street, that if you start to unravel your bike network and your car network, that you can start to create distinct networks that both serve your community. So maybe you've got an arterial street that doesn't have a protected bike lane, but you actually have a car-free path that is very close proximity that serves the same destination. So you might be able to come up with an exception to that, but if you really want biking to be a legitimate mode of transportation, you need to be able to essentially go from anywhere to anywhere. And so you do need to be able to have a legitimate route on those main streets where we've been putting all of our destinations and where we have all of our places to be. But you've got to pick your priorities. And if you come to the city and say, I want every street to have a protected bike lane, they won't really even know what to do with that. That's just like too much. And so a strong sense of the priorities that will let you get to where you want to be is just as important as the vision of protected bike lanes everywhere. So which is the street you want to start on first and second and third, and that will help you get there.
I appreciate that. And I'm glad you brought up our poor beleaguered traffic engineers, because I wanted to ask a question on their behalf. I think this has been a really infrastructure design intensive talk. And that puts the engineers in the hot seat, right? Because they are responsible ultimately for designing and building our roadways. And so if we're not happy with it, we're essentially saying something's broke with the way that we're designing and building our streets, and we need their help if we want to make any changes. And there's a few key things that always come up in these conversations. Starting with the standards that our engineers are held to or that they hold themselves to, and some of the things that they hear from people when they try to make changes, because as they're not interested in getting yelled at by an angry public. And as much as many of the people on this talk tonight would love to see, entire parking lanes or travel lanes removed in favor of better biking and walking infrastructure, we know that there are plenty of other people who are using those facilities who are going to have things to say too. So what do you say how do you engage in those conversations, knowing that you're sort of setting your engineers up for a difficult road ahead?
Yeah. Yeah, as someone who gets yelled at a lot in public at public meetings, like I don't always take all the heat that the engineers take. And I talk to my city traffic engineer and other engineers, and like they go to court a lot. Part of their job is like having to go to court to justify the street design that's on the ground. And so this ties to that standards thing, is that there's a lot of trying to kind of cover your ass in this field and this industry. And that's probably right, just given the world that we're in. But it does mean that they have got to approach this with care. So I think that one of the coolest things is just the wealth of information and innovation that's coming out of our professional organizations. NACTO has led the way. A lot of communities they're like, that doesn't work for me. NACTO is maybe a big city thing, but FHWA is now on board. They want these things. They're saying these things. The new AASHTO bike guide is being developed and soon to be published. Who knows when? Next year, the year after, it's not clear, but that is going to include protected bike lanes, protected intersections. They will include all of this design so that it's no longer an exceptional design and an innovative design or an experimental design. It is the standard design. And so I think that will be a huge boon for communities that are facing issues about this isn't the standard. Well, actually now it is. So I think that will really help. And then the issues around the angry public, that is a challenge. We, because of the political nature of this work, it is subject to political sways. And ultimately, if you do something and it upsets everyone, was that really the right thing to do? It's like, that's also part of that strategy of where should we be focusing our energies, and let's try to achieve success. So I would say there's probably low-hanging fruit. It's probably a little bit of where do we really need it? And then also, where can we do this with maybe the least heartburn, the least pain, and the most success? Because you also want to demonstrate success. Don't start with your hardest intersection to solve. Start with one that seems like it's ready to go, and prove to people that it can work, prove to the engineers that it's not that scary, work through the issues of standards. And maybe you've got to often we'll have to write memos justifying departure from standards or exploration with an experimental design. And I think that kind of approach will let you kind of get your ducks in a row and cross your T's and dot your I's, so that when you do have those hard projects, you can point to the success and make it easier for next time.
I was watching in the chat as you were talking, people were naming roads in Corvallis that they find particularly difficult to navigate on a bike. And I'm not going to name any particular road, but I will say that on multiple occasions, intersections with state roadways came up. And that introduces yet another challenge, right? Where you have a new layer of bureaucracy and of people who are in charge of making standards and decisions and design treatments. And so what are your recommendations for a community that has concerns about a state facility?
Yeah, it's interesting. ODOT in the 90s, this really blows my mind a little bit. In the 90s, ODOT was a leader in bicycle and pedestrian transportation. They had a design guide as a part of their plans that other states would reference. They'd say, oh, how do we do this bike design thing? Let's go to the ODOT bike design guide. Like, that's a little bit mind-blowing today in what feels like, they haven't kept up. But I know they're trying, and they're starting to do some really good work. They've got a new thing out there called the Blueprint for Urban Design, which is trying to reconcile their pressures for mobility with the urban kind of community needs. And so I think that actually introduces a lot of design flexibility into the process. And so you may find that you've got more options than ever before when it comes to what's possible on those streets. Advocating with ODOT, though, it can be challenging. They're doing their own priorities, they're doing their own thing. But if you can convince them that that's the project that they're working on, they now have the tools, I think, to do a much better job than before. So it's not as dire as maybe it has been in the past.
Yeah, I want to ask a follow-up question about that. I was watching carefully to see what types of vehicles you included in your graphics about intersections. And I saw a few box trucks and there was a bus, but one of the communities that that often is very vocal about street and intersection design, and especially state design, is the freight community. What do you have to say about how you navigate that? You mentioned aprons, which is great, but a lot of times freight concerns are about more than that. They're about travel times. They're about our economy. They're about delivering goods in a timely manner. And that kind of gets back to the priorities that you mentioned at the beginning. So you could address that.
Yeah, I do not know how you'll be able to really address, like, respond to freight interests who may or may not be really honestly representing like what their priorities are. But this is an area that there's a lot of myth out there. You know, there's this fear of, you know, you hear from business owners, you hear it on main streets, this fear that slowing down cars or changing the amount of cars on a street is going to hurt their business or hurt the economy. There's not evidence to support that, but it's a lot of things people believe deep down in their hearts, right? It's a very emotional response in a lot of ways. You know, truckers already know not to drive during rush hour for long haul stuff. They're going to do that in off hours to avoid congestion. So they're already kind of responding in kind. One thing I would say, though, that's really helpful, and it's been helpful in Portland, is we have in our transportation plan a multi-layered classification system. You may be familiar with like the functional classification of a street. You've got your local street, your collector street, your arterial street. We have 7 layers in our classification system, which is a little bit crazy, like walking and biking and emergency response and freight. Freight has a layer, and what being able to have those layers lets us have more nuanced conversations, right? Does every street need to have a wide radius for a large turn? No, not every street, but yeah, these 2 major freight routes are intersecting. And so we're probably going to have to design that to be a little more freight accommodating than the local streets or these other combinations. And so I think that having kind of a mature understanding of how freight interacts with your city can really help that conversation. It won't eliminate the conversation, but it lets you focus on the places that really matter to people, and maybe get some agreement that at these other places, it's less important and we don't have to worry about it as much.
I want to turn to a couple of the questions that we've had in the Q&A. There's a couple, including one from a city councilor and another from a resident, that sort of get at the same thing, which is, you know, we're a small sized city, maybe slightly mid-sized, with a limited budget. And you showed some really cool, like fancier infrastructure. And then you showed some like cheap, quick build versions of the same thing. And people are wondering, what's the balance between like slapping together and addressing a bunch of streets using quick build stuff, or focusing on greenways where we can build a lot of miles really quickly, versus devoting a lot more time to and money to those key intersections where we know there's fatalities or greater crash risk?
Yeah, I'm always so torn on this question. Fundamentally, it points to the fact that we do not fund ourselves enough in the realm of transportation in this country and in this state. You know, I think I don't know all the stats of how Oregon compares to other states, but I don't think we give ourselves as much money as other states do to try to solve these same problems. So at some point, there's a little bit of like, we need to get real about how much this costs. I don't know how it's going in Corvallis, but in Portland, like the cost of infrastructure is just skyrocketing. Traffic signals used to cost, you know, $200,000. Now they cost $1 million. And it's like, can you plan for that? How can you build for that? When it comes to quick build versus more permanent infrastructure, the cost difference is outrageous. It's like an order of magnitude. So if you could build for 1 mile of high quality protected bike lane, you could build 10 miles of quick build protected bike lane. And I think in kind of the urgency we feel to build out our bikeway network, to create those connections, at least in Portland, we've been favoring the quick build work. That's almost all we build. But we are reaching kind of a breaking point a little bit, that those facilities work well to deploy quickly and cheaply, but over the long haul, they actually cost quite a bit to maintain. Those plastic posts get knocked over all the time. The markings have to be restriped. The drainage may not quite work as well as you want it to be, and it collects more debris. So you end up having this long run cost that does get very real. And we're now kind of running into that in the city of Portland, where it's, we have to have these conversations. Can we even do quick build because of these added maintenance costs? So it's just like a little bit maddening. Simultaneously, I have to admit, the quick build stuff, it's not very pretty. It doesn't look that appealing. It's hard for me to imagine that like my mom is going to want to ride her bike on some of these streets, even though technically it's a protected bike lane. I'm like, yeah, technically they're the same thing, but realistically they're not. And I even think that to some degree in some communities, we ran into this a little bit in some of our East Portland communities, where biking rates are low in East Portland. And we come in and we build these quick build protected bike lanes that they're kind of ugly and they're not that appealing. And the community is like, what is this? I don't want this. I won't use this. What they really want are trees on their treeless sidewalks. And so like, could we think a little bit bigger about meeting more community needs? And the bigger a project is, the more you'll be able to meet those comprehensive community needs. And so, I think if we went in and did a road diet and added a tree-lined buffer to protect a bike lane, you'd have a very different response to what is essentially the same project. But it does cost a lot more money. So that is an ultimate dilemma. I would say that quick build is good to get energy going, but ideally it's a part of a pipeline that is from pilot to permanent, and that you can deploy stuff quickly and then have a program to actually build it in a more real, robust way. But that takes real money, and that's either going to be maybe, hey, the new infrastructure bill, maybe there's something in there that's going to help us out. But it's definitely a huge challenge, and I'm a little bit torn on the response. I don't know what the right answer is, but I think it's probably very, very specific to kind of where you're at politically, where you're at financially.
I appreciate that. And since you mentioned sort of addressing specific needs of particular neighborhoods or particular communities, I wanted to mention a question that we got about universal design, which isn't really something that you addressed much in this talk. Can you mention maybe some of the things that would be part of a protected intersection that would specifically address the needs of people with disabilities?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's interesting, we point a lot to Europe when we're like, how do we do biking better? One thing we do better in America, believe it or not, is accessibility. The standards we have for accessibility help ensure that our new projects, especially those higher cost capital projects, can meet some real standards for mobility. That is still kind of an emerging practice. I think that there are concerns about how protected bike lanes interact with the sidewalk and how those zones work. But I think that the principles of accessible design apply into protected bike lanes fairly well, just like they do with traditional transportation design. I don't think that there's anything where questions are completely unanswered. When you start getting into the realm of sidewalk level bike lanes that are raised up to sidewalk level with a level surface between the two areas, that gets super touchy. And that's where I think there are a lot of unanswered accessibility questions. But when you've got a little bit of a separation between your bike lane and your walkway, it gets a lot more clear in how you can make sure that there's a detectable edge between the walking area and the biking area, that there's tactile warnings that help you indicate when you're crossing the road. When you've got a safety island, that you can mark that as a safety island with tactile warnings as well, so people can recognize that kind of that legibility of the tactile warnings. I do think that when you look at protected intersections, a kind of distinct feature of them is the way we try to pull the crosswalks back away from the intersection. And I think that there's actually real tremendous benefits to that for people who are who have vision disabilities in just crossing people at the shortest crossing distance, orienting people directly across the intersection instead of things like a corner. You know, you all know the corner ramps, that diagonal ramp in the corner that does both directions, it leads you straight in the middle of the intersection. That's no good. But yeah, if you can pull this back, then you can get more clarity for people crossing. So I think that there's some elements there that can be more legible than maybe traditional designs usually are.
Since you used the word legibility, I'm going to pivot to ask one of the questions we got early on in the talk, which may have been inspired by your graph of changing modes. And this person was specifically asking about self-driving cars, and if we need to be thinking about like how we program our self-driving cars or how we design our streets so that they play nice together when this future arrives.
You know, I keep hoping that self-driving cars are going to be the answer to our infrastructure problems, that like the need to create cleanly legible streets for the computer and everyone's fixation on this future of self-driving cars is going to then like suddenly pump millions of dollars into America's infrastructure so that we can make it like self-driving car compatible. Like that would be amazing. That'd be a cool outcome of that. I don't think that's where we're going. I think they're trying to create cars smart enough to handle even the worst of urban conditions. But yeah, you know, for the city of Portland, we've got pretty clear policies, still pretty high level, but our thinking having to do with automated vehicles is that to the degree that they are personal vehicles, we don't want them. Get them, we don't care. You know, we've got this chart. Maybe you've seen these sort of upside down triangle of a hierarchy of modes. You've got walking on the top and then biking and then transit. Then we put in like fleets of autonomous vehicles. Like we want autonomous vehicles, but we want them to be things like Uber or Lyft or some sort of fleet vehicle that we're all sharing so that we can try to create a future with less driving. Autonomous vehicles really threaten anything that changes the economics of driving to make it easier or cheaper to drive longer. It's a bad thing. It's going to contribute to more VMT and more just car externalities. So not to say that we don't need to worry about them, but right now we're in the realm of policy. So when we set policy related to autonomous vehicles, that's what it is. That said, I have huge hopes for autonomous vehicle technology to revolutionize transit. Why can't we use the same technology instead of for a personal car, put it in a bus that goes on the same route every day, that takes you on the same line? It seems like that should be a lower bar for us. And maybe we can get to a point where our transit system is fully autonomous, running 24 hours a day with 15-minute headways. You know, that's the future of a less car dependent place, using that technology for good rather than just feeding the personal car paradigm.
I want to ask another little nitpicky question that someone brought up. So short of installing a complete protected intersection, what are some good approaches to addressing particularly the problem of right hooks, which is where a vehicle turns right across a bicycle lane and has a conflict with a bicyclist who's riding straight?
Yeah, so bike signals can be really good. If you've got the space for turn lanes and you've got a lot of turning vehicles, separate those two spaces out in time. Cars stop at a red light, they have no turn on red, and then bicyclists can go on a green light. We've got a couple of these installed in Portland at some very high conflict locations. And it works fairly well. As you know, people are not turning on red, blows my mind every time. And it lets you go straight safely. And you're in a skinny little bike lane. It's not like a big wide bike lane. So if you don't have a lot of room for physical protection, then I think bike signals are a really good answer. Otherwise, maybe you can't do a full bike signal. There's a thing called a leading pedestrian interval, where pedestrians get to walk. They get a little bit of a head start. You might be able to offer something like that for bicyclists as well. And then the real key for the right hook is in some ways, at least physically, that space, that width. You know, for a lot of like the last 20 years, the old days of bikeway design, we really emphasized trying to keep bikes close to the cars so they had visibility. You know, like you're right next to them, they're going to see you. They're going to see you when they're coming up, passing you, or. But I think that we're realizing that that's not necessarily wrong, but there's other ways of creating that visibility, and that separation really can help. And that is giving people that space and time to react can give people protection against the right hook. You know, so many problems are solved by slowing people down, slowing drivers down. But you can be right hooked at 5 miles an hour. Like a car just has to like bump into you, and then you're on the ground, and then a wheel has just run over you. You know, like that doesn't necessarily get fixed by slowing people down. But if you're able to provide that space, then you actually have a chance to react. You have a chance to stop, which I think with our skinny bike lanes next to travel lanes, you don't always have that chance.
Someone else asked similarly about slip lanes, like, what's your beef with slip lanes? You mentioned them a couple of different times. So if you could quickly maybe clarify for the less transportation techie folks in the audience, what's the problem with slip lanes?
Yeah, slip lanes are almost entirely designed to move traffic fast. Like that is their purpose. It's get you out of the road that you're on, get you onto the road that you want to be on. And you often get to bypass the signal, right? Like you're so special, you get to skip the whole signal and just zoom on past. It's interesting that there are some stated pedestrian benefits to a slip lane, like the exposure. We talk about limiting exposure a lot today as a key design principle. Technically, yes, the slip lane lets the pedestrian crossing be maybe shorter than it otherwise would be with a wide turning radius. But yeah, they're in general, they are infrastructure designed to make driving fast and easy, and it comes at an incredible expense for people walking and biking, because the bike lane that slip lane has to cross is incredibly exposed with huge speed differentials between people biking and the car that's trying to turn, right? They're turning at 30 miles an hour, you're biking at 10, at 15. That's not good to mix that. And then a pedestrian, especially, let's say someone who's got a vision disability, is trying to cross this slip lane diagonally with this car coming, and there's no signal control at all. There's no indication when it's clear or when it's safe. There are some good designs out there, though. If you have to do a slip lane, there are some good designs that that focus on kind of creating more of a tight angle for the slip lane that can bring in features like raised crossings of that slip lane, so that drivers do have a little bit, they've got a few features, traditional design features of tight corner radiuses and raised crossings, speed bumps that slow them down, so that those same ideas of you can still have the slip lane, but like let's design it to be slower and safer so that it doesn't come with so many trade-offs for people walking and biking. Especially in a freight district, in a freight area, those may be unavoidable.
Cool. Nick, we only have like 5 minutes left. And this has gone so fast. And so I think we have time for one more question. And I'm gonna do kind of a twofer and say I want to leave people with a sense of what's next and what we can do to try and make change in our own community. And so people have been asking, like, how do we provide training for our engineers? How do we do visioning as a community to all get on the same page about this type of infrastructure and about our mode split targets? How do we organize around guerrilla installations or quick build designs or whatever you want to call it, so that there's some tools in the toolbox both for our engineers and the community?
I can only answer without a lot of close knowledge of like what the ecosystem of the city and the community is like in Corvallis today. You know, if your bike plan or your ped plan haven't been updated recently, or maybe don't feel as fresh as they need to be, advocate to get that funded as a project, because the planning of a bike plan or a ped plan can maybe be a vehicle for community conversations. You know, depending on how they work with, they kind of scope it out. They could probably hire a consulting firm that specializes in these types of conversations to come in and help have that community conversation, to host panels where speakers come to vision what is this future of the quiet, calm Corvallis that we know that it can be. So I think that's probably a good way to approach it. If you feel like there's not enough kind of capacity in-house, we can bring people in to help add to that capacity. And that can include design trainings for engineers. I think guerrilla installations are really cool. I don't know whether there's been much tactical urbanism, whether it's condoned or not in Corvallis. That can be really a fun way to have a conversation, especially as a part of a project. You know, these days more than ever, it feels like we're in a position to kind of like try it out, see how it works, make some changes. So generally, that probably requires some level of support from your kind of transportation department's leadership and to make some of those things happen. But that may be another part of that conversation. Hey, we want to do these types of community-oriented things. And I think that you hopefully will have an open ear at the city to at least have that conversation. And build friends with your politicians. You know, I don't know the structure in Corvallis, but in Portland, like our bureaus are so tied to our commissioners, our elected officials, that it creates sometimes a really weird dynamic. But, you know, if you can convince an elected official, then they can make things happen. And, you know, maybe it's not that different in Corvallis in some ways.
Okay, I think I'm going to get the hook here. So I'm going to mute myself and hand it back to Steve. But thank you again, Nick, so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you,
Thanks,
Nick and
Sarah.
Sarah. Thank you, Nick and Sarah. Wonderful presentation, riveting discussion. Thank you both so much. That concludes our Street Talk program. I'd also like to thank everyone for attending and for asking so many great questions. I'd like to thank the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition and our co-sponsors, City of Corvallis Active Transportation Group, for making this event possible. Just in case you are interested, let me share the screen here, in the resources mentioned in my introduction and in Nick's talk. I'll be sending links to Nick and my resources in an email to all attendees. I'd like to bring your attention though to the City of Corvallis Active Transportation Group's webpage. They have a really nice webpage. And then if you would like to get involved in the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition, the Transportation Action Team, which I'm part of, or another coalition action team, please visit the coalition website. So thanks again to Nick and Sarah, and a very special thanks to all of you for attending. Take care and good night.